Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to the final session of today's program. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to be introducing Herbert Giradet, our keynote speaker. And I'd been planning to try to survey all of the amazing stuff that he's done, but we're running about half an hour late, so I'll keep it very short. He's a co-founder of the World Futures Council and member of the Club of Rome, and has received the UN Award for services to the environment. And he's also had experience as a practical farmer, which I think is extremely important. He's played a great role throughout his career, both with respect to the environment in general and his work in the Amazon, for example, and more specifically in relation to cities, which is our specific focus here. And he's played a pioneering role in the ecological footprint tool, which we use to analyze the impact of cities. And I think his thinking has always been at the cutting edge and has been defining the way we think. So he's begun to question the notion of sustainability and has been talking more about regenerative systems. And so I think these are among the new ideas which he's been putting into the debate. And he's acted as consultant to many important cities, including London. But he hasn't just been working with the official world, but particularly with public opinion and with the mass movement, which I think is crucial. He's made a series of TV documentaries dealing with general environmental issues and with the impact of cities, which have had a immense impact in launching the environmental consciousness which we have today at a personal level, because I work in food systems and to do with urban agriculture. I was just rereading his early book, Land for the People, which he published in 1976, and it struck me then how immensely far-sighted it was, laying out a kind of mapping a kind of strategy which has been helped to guide, I think, subsequent social movements, and we've seen this through in the experience which I've had with the impact of the Global South, particularly upon the social movements in this country, the Mexican Zapatistas and the Indian farmers movement, and the solidarity networks which were developed over here to support those movements, have really linked in very much with the kind of blueprint which Herbert laid down in that early period. And so I think it's particularly this impact in terms of the social movements, which in my view are the fundamental factors which will guarantee a sustainable or regenerative future, which I think is particularly remarkable contribution. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker.
Goodness me. Thank you, Robert. I'm not sure whether you were talking about me. I think you're talking about somebody else here, but very kind and honored to meet you again after many years and to do a sort of final presentation here this evening. The metabolism of cities, of course, has been the topic that's been discussed all day by many different presentations. And so I'm going to pick up on some of what has been said already, but also try and sort of go a little bit beyond some of the concepts that have been raised here in the discussion so far. And I'm just about to try and put in the next slide. And now, how does that work? Sorry? Okay, yeah. Yeah, so brief summary of what I'm going to be saying here. Starting at this, we've heard about phase change. I'm also going to be talking about phase change between different types of cities. Agropolis, Petropolis, and Ecopolis at the end will be this sort of key sort of frame around which I'll be doing my presentation. So Agropolis is also represented by von Thünen's work on the isolated state. I'll come back to that. Then briefly looking at the metabolism of London, which I've done some work on. Petropolis, the city that we live in today, running on fossil fuels. Footprints, rucksacks, metabolism of an urbanizing world, the global impacts of our move into an urban future. Then really, I think there's a need to redefine the concept of urban ecology. And then specifically going back to the urban metabolism, how we need to move from linear to circular, and then going a little bit into this concept of the regenerative city, a specific case study from Adelaide where I worked 10 years ago and what has happened there since then. And then finally, the question of can we actually implement some of these ideas in the wider world. So starting with Agropolis, really many of you geographers would be familiar with this concept of the isolated state coming from the 19th century German geographer Heinrich von Thünen, who basically argued that if in the absence of major transport systems, cities would logically be surrounded by rings of different types of cultivation with the market gardens right close to the city itself, relying on refertilization from human waste as well as animal waste, and then moving out into the town forest. Timber is heavy, firewood is heavy, so if you don't have any lorries or trucks running on fossil fuels, you better have them near your town as your main energy source as well as main source of building material, and then gradually moving out further, the less intensive methods of cultivation to produce crop for the city, and finally the grazing further out on the, close to the sort of wilderness areas, half a mile or 2 miles away from the village, or a little bit further out if it's a town. So this is kind of something that has been established as a reality in different parts of the world, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. There was a fascinating study done in the 70s by a book called The Road to Alto in Portugal, where this system was still in operation until the first roads were built and everything changed. So here just a kind of 17th century print showing the walled town and how it is surrounded by different fields of cultivation. Of course, not strictly circles. Obviously, road systems, footpaths and so on allow for food to be brought in from a little bit further afield sometimes. If you live on terraces, like in Asia here, then you would end up with a sort of more linear system. But by and large, the reality of having to have your food supply, your timber supply close by in an urban or village system that is operated primarily by muscle power and solar energy. So these are certainly realities that can still be observed in different parts of the world. Now, we moved out of Agropolis as a result of the discovery of methods of bringing out coal from in the earth crust. So Petropolis is where we live today, and the fundamental changes that have resulted in the way we relate to the world around us, of course directly driven by fossil fuel technology. And of course London was one of the pioneers of this development, a city of about 1 million people in 1800, and then growing to 6.5 million 100 years later, and 8.5 or so by 1939, when that process stopped for a while as a result of the war. So London, we've heard about London's sewage system. I've also looked into that quite a bit. It's a fascinating story, the story of the Great Stink. And what wasn't said yet in the last presentation, that as a result of London's decision to build a sewage disposal system via Bazalgette's engineering efforts, Liebig and other scientists, directly as a result of that decision, started developing artificial fertilizers. Absolutely directly linked to that, because Liebig and others asked the question, how can farmland be kept productive if we do not recycle human waste? And so we've heard about guano as an interim step to keep land productive, but certainly artificial fertilizers came directly as a result of this decision made in London in 1858 and beyond. Already talked about the various fossil fuel technologies that define the modern life that we live in Petropolis. And so London today, a wonderful city, a great city of cultural diversity, of ethnic diversity, place where the world meets. It's also one of the one of only two really global cities, London and New York, where financial decisions, of course, are made that then affect other cities elsewhere. And I'll come back to that in terms of their industrial development and so on and so forth. So London today, but no longer a very big city compared with other cities in China, in South America, in Brazil, in Mexico, and so on. London is currently about 7.5 million, having shrunk slightly from the 1940s onwards, whereas you have Tokyo, the metropolitan area of some 35 million people now, Chongqing, similar size in China. These are the vast cities that are now there on the face of the planet. And so we are living in this urbanizing world that has extraordinary impacts, not just on the lives of people, but on the global ecosystems that cities depend on. So I did a sort of study on London's metabolism. That was 1995, partly based on figures from the London Research Centre and partly from my own research. And you don't have to look at the figures in all detail other than to say, you know, these are sort of studies that are now being done in many cities around the world to try and ascertain exactly what quantities of resources go in and what quantities of waste come out the other end. And so this is certainly a methodology that is now widely used, and we've just heard about figures from Birmingham specifically relating to energy input. London currently, or certainly when I did this study, I don't think the figure would have gone up that much, uses roughly about 2 supertankers of oil equivalent per week in order to keep it going in terms of all the energy input into the urban system of London. And this is a sort of figure that just doesn't only relate to London, but basically us as Europeans. This is a picture, any idea what it represents? Basically energy slaves. You know, we as biological beings, simply in terms of our muscle power and so on, and the daily food intake that enables us to exist, have about a sort of energy output of about 100 watts. But our daily lives actually have a throughput of about 6,000 watts. So there's 60 times more energy that goes into our daily lives than we actually produce by biological means. And this is an extraordinary process of amplification of us as individual human beings that is particularly exemplified in the urban lifestyles that we lead today. So here are some pictures, you know, showing the realities of the massive dependence on motors, on transportation systems, on power stations that add up to this some 6,000 watts that we utilize in our daily lives. In Europe, in America, the figure is about 110 energy slaves, and in the Middle East, in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, in places like that, it's probably more like 200 energy slaves per person, depending on this daily throughput of fossil fuels. Now, just quick look at transportation systems here, relating to the density of urban form. You know, we can see here how energy throughput through the transportation systems are highest in the low-density cities of America and Australia as well, and then gradually the traditional cities of Europe, or indeed the high-density cities of Asia, have a lowest per capita energy throughput for transportation. Extraordinary difference between in urban footprints here, Atlanta on the one hand, with pretty much the same numbers of people in one place, 2.5 or so million people, as compared with Barcelona, and the enormous difference in terms of urban footprint. Of course, Barcelona coming out of the 18th, 19th century, where, you know, transport based on muscle power was the main form of transport, whereas, of course, Atlanta, you know, being the ultimate example of a petropolis. And here's a sort of comparison. At the top here, Atlanta and its transportation systems. At the bottom, Barcelona. At the top, primarily, of course, reliance almost entirely on the private motor car. At the bottom, you know, the reliance on the tram system and domestic housing, which is basically apartment buildings, compact apartment building arrangements. So, you know, certainly if you look at the figures, and I don't have precise figures for these two cities in terms of energy use, but certainly Barcelona would by far be much more energy efficient, of course, than Atlanta. But Atlanta, of course, is the model, or the type of city that Atlanta represents, is the model today in the world for building cities. And this is one of the great problems that the world faces. So a quick summary of the kind of key points, really, of how we affect the world today in terms of, on the one hand, the increases in human numbers that have taken place from the beginning of the 20th century onwards. So fourfold increase, or 4.5 by 2012, but 15-fold increase in urban populations. And the next point being some 60% of the world population are expected to live in urban areas by 2030, with that figure going up further by 2050. And so the key question is, what are the implications of that for the planet as a whole? It's often said, and there's a recent book that was published, The Triumph of the Cities. Cities are the solution to the world's sustainability problems. Well, it's more complex than that, because, okay, here in Europe, the per capita footprints of urban people are not that different from people in rural areas. But certainly when you see the massive inflow of people in Asia into cities from villages, the typical increase is about fourfold in terms of per capita resource consumption, with enormous implications then for the rest of the world, and particularly the biosphere as a whole. So people have made the point that we now live in the Anthropocene, which is the period in time when humanity's activities dominate the impacts on the global environment. And here are just the extraordinary increases in every kind of consumption of resources, but also increases in human numbers that have taken place over the last 100 or so years. So, you know, this kind of picture couldn't have been taken before we had satellites, or indeed before, you know, the world was lit up by fossil fuel energy, primarily, with some inputs of other forms of energy I'll come back to in a moment. But certainly the reality is that the world has changed fundamentally then. And I'd say that this is a bit of a controversial point, perhaps, but cities are entropy accelerators in the fact that they're heat engines. They take resources from nature, particularly fossil fuel resources, and we all know about the fact that as energy is used, it ends up as forms of disorder that result ultimately also then, of course, in major changes to the atmosphere as well. So we have basically linear input-output systems that characterize our cities today, and that certainly begins to look like as a really major problem in terms of the long-term existence of humanity on this global environment that we live in. So here's a couple of pictures of the extraordinary transformations that have taken place. Here a picture of Pudong Island in the heart of today's Shanghai 30 years ago, and that's what it looks like today. Same place. This is the new Manhattan in the heart of Shanghai, which is now, of course, the banks, the insurance companies, the international trading houses that have their headquarters there. Absolutely extraordinary change that took place as a result of Deng Xiaoping's decision to open the door of China to foreign investment, primarily from London and from New York. The capital that flowed into China was entirely foreign in the early stages of this development, and so this results in this dramatic change in urban form. The old picture here, I was actually in Shanghai, you know, when the first big tall buildings had been built, and you could look down and you could still see the urban farms right in the middle of the city. So this amazing transformation. Or look at Dubai, look at this street line here, and this is what it looks like today. So amazing sort of urban transformation. All of this in the last couple of decades. It's just astonishing how this, driven by fossil fuel inputs, has resulted. And these are the power stations that have been built in order to power cities like Dubai. So certainly people are beginning to study the question, or try to address the question, even in the Middle East, how whether or not the ways in which power is provided to a city region like Dubai, what are the conversion rates, what are the efficiency losses, and so on, as you can see at the top there. So it is clear that our input of fossil fuels into our urban system is astonishingly inefficient, particularly because of its reliance on turbines, on fossil fuel powered, gas turbines and diesel engines and so on, with typical conversion losses approximating some 3/4. So certainly, at least the least thing we can do is address that issue in terms of energy efficiency of transport systems, of buildings, and so on. If we insist on an urban future, we better make efficient use of these energy resources that are not going to be there a second time. We can only exploit and burn fossil fuels once, and then they will end up as waste gases and ultimately as climate change. I've worked quite a lot in the Middle East in the last few years, and some of these pictures that you see on the edge of these towns and cities are just astonishing, because they don't have the recycling industries that we are beginning to develop more and more actively in Europe and also to some extent in the United States. So you end up with these huge waste dumps of discarded tires, of cars, car bodies that haven't been melted down yet. Some of them will end up being exported to China or to India and ultimately turn up as material, steel girders for buildings and so on. And here the resource inputs into our urban systems is the Carajás mine in Brazil, one of the largest piles of iron ore anywhere on the planet, surrounded still by rainforest areas. But that is, the rainforests are rapidly being cut down, partly because the iron ore is smelted using charcoal from forests. So there is the issue not only of ecological footprints, which I'll come back to in more detail in a moment, but also the question of ecological rucksacks, which comes from research originally at the Wuppertal Institute in Germany, where the quantities of materials that are required in order to produce, say, a gold ring here is 400 kilograms of rock and soil that have to be extracted in order to produce that 1 gram of gold. And so these are extraordinary figures that I think we really need to be clear about in terms of the impacts of urban demand for resources on the global environment. And here the ecological footprint then, the actual areas taken up by cities themselves are really quite small if you look at the top of this slide, whereas the areas required to supply a city like London or New York with food is about 40 or 50 times the actual surface area of London. And then the area that would be required if we actually had the sense to set these areas aside to absorb CO2 emissions by tree planting and by carbon sequestration in soils, again, would be 50, 60 times London's surface area. So I did a study linked to my work on metabolism, on London's metabolism in 95, coming up with a figure of about 125 times London's actual surface area would be required to keep London going on a long-term basis. But another study that was subsequently done more than doubled that figure. Why? Because I had not included food waste, I had not included pet food, and marine resources. So the study that was done about 10 years ago came up with 293 times London's surface area being its ecological footprint. So that is more than twice the surface area of the UK, but London only has 12% of the UK's population. And this is a map of the areas on the planet actually now influenced by human activity. And so certainly pretty much of the productive land on the planet in one way or another now serves as input into urban supplies of various kinds, food supplies, timber supplies, and so on. And this is the kind of what it looks like in reality. The conversion of rainforest here into cattle ranches, into mines, the timber, and so on and so forth. More recently, in the Amazon in particular, the conversion of land, former forest and savanna land in Mato Grosso into these vast soybean fields that are required as animal feeds that we use in Europe and China and so on. Or in Malaysia, palm oil plantations. And this is a really shocking picture, I find. This is actually the shark fins on a roof in Shanghai being dried to make shark fin soup. It's just extraordinary how, as you urbanize, as countries urbanize, their demand for delicacies will also grow to extraordinary degrees. And by the way, I'm nearly at the end of my tales of woe here. I'm going to start talking. Another important systemic point here already, relating to what we talked about in connection with Bazalgette here, the fact that this is the sewage plume of Rio de Janeiro. It is not only the fact that the coastal waters are being clouded and therefore make the sea surfaces, the seabed below less productive, but also this continuous loss of nutrients and particularly phosphates from farmland through the stomachs of urban citizens into the sea in this one-way traffic of nutrients. Of course, the clouding also of cities themselves in terms of this Mexico City and its waste gas plume of SO2, NOx, and other waste gases. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we know all about this, the melting of ice in the Arctic and so on and so forth. So certainly the critical systemic problem that we face is that the CO2 output of an urbanizing humanity, only about half of that is actually absorbed by vegetation, in terms of plant growth, in terms of algal growth in the oceans, in terms of coral reef carbon sequestration. And that is the critical issue that we are dealing with in these climate negotiations that are being held in conferences around the world. So the question is, are we going to end up with this kind of future of cities basically submerged ultimately as victims of their own CO2 emissions? And by the way, these towns are some of the biggest cities on the planet, and the axis here are the cities that are close to the oceans will ultimately be affected very significantly by sea level rises. So London already, of course, responded to this threat even back in the 70s, building the Thames Barrier, which was designed to be closed only once or twice a year and has to be closed far more now as a result of unexpected floods and sea level rises. So far it's only been about 20 centimeters of sea level rises all over the planet, but certainly with surges coming in, this can cause unexpected flooding, and certainly London needs these kind of barriers in order to protect itself, or the Dutch have these extraordinary high-tech barriers to prevent floods affecting their farmland and their towns. So one proposal is, if current trends continue in terms of sea level rises, which are accelerating now, do we have to build floating cities instead of coastal cities? And so there are some architects coming ideas for this. So all of this into sort of trying to suggest that we may have to move out of Petropolis and move into a new kind of town or city, which I call here ecopolis. Now this draws to some extent on this sort of concept of agropolis that I showed at the beginning, but it basically argues that with new energy, renewable energy technologies now available to us, it is certainly plausible and quite possible to talk about towns, more easily towns and larger cities, to be powered by renewable energy resources instead of fossil fuels. And so certainly we are beginning to see significant steps in that direction, in combination, of course, with major energy efficiency measures. So in terms of conceptual points, I think it's quite important to look at this discipline that many of us here in this room work in, which is urban ecology, and argue that it's no longer conceptually adequate to talk just about the ecology, the living environments within cities themselves, but we really need to include the ecological footprints of our cities and our understanding of what urban ecology is about, and really begin to expand our horizons in terms of how we think about these things. In some ways, you could argue we are still, as urban researchers, in a sort of pre-Galilean sort of mind horizon, where basically we think the world circulates, or sort of, the globe, circulates around cities. Well, we must really begin to realize that cities are very highly and totally dependent on environments elsewhere, and that it is critically important to expand our mind horizons in that direction. So there's really very important research going on in terms of factor 4, factor 5 reductions in resource throughput through our urban systems. And we've had quite a number of very specific areas of not just research, but technological development, in moving in this direction. And the kind of example of phase change, the example of energy efficient transport systems, all of them, of course, take us in that direction. And here's just one very fascinating example of the progress being made in insulation materials for building. 30 years ago, fiberglass was the norm, and if you wanted really significant energy efficiency in buildings, you would have to now have something like 30 centimeters of fiberglass. Then more efficient polystyrenes and so on came along, and they reduced that quite a bit. And then you have, on the right-hand side, PU polyurethane insulation materials like Celotex or Kingspan, which have already further reduced the need for thickness of insulation material. But the latest version now is vacuum insulation panels on the left-hand side, which has the same insulation effect as this great wodge of fiberglass on the right-hand side. And several companies, including Kingspan, which is one of the major companies for polyurethane insulation, are now developing this for internal building insulation. Now, this has really significant implications for architecture and particularly also for retrofit of existing buildings. Because if you can insulate from inside, you can obviously avoid losing very much space if you use vacuum insulation panels. Whereas with fiberglass, if you try and put a wodge of that inside your house, you end up with a tiny little living room or something. So that's clearly a very important technological step that is now being taken. And whilst the cost of obviously these latest insulation materials, such as vacuum insulation panels, is still more expensive than the conventional materials, this is certainly heading our way as a really significant option for house insulation and particularly for retrofits. And here's this stuff being fitted to a domestic dwelling somewhere in Britain. Water efficiency. This is a very important, of course, point, again, has been raised in some of the contributions. Here's the water system of Singapore, because of the fact that they have a sort of slightly hostile neighbor in the form of Malaysia, where they rely on for their water. Singapore has developed this immensely efficient water recycling system, a truly circular system where water is drunk again and again and again after having been recycled with using membrane technology and so on. So certainly London too has a much greater water efficiency than it had in the past by efficient use of technology. And we too re-drink our water several times before it's finally flushed away. But so certainly in an urbanizing world, which is so very dependent on rainfall, and often in a long way away cities today, modern cities that are being built often have very long distance water supply systems. So kind of the key point of talking about the metabolism of cities, for me, is to take the example of where we are at the moment, where cities are largely linear resource throughput systems, and begin to learn really the lesson of how nature uses resources. All wastes in nature end up as new growth of trees, of every kind of plant. And right now in the autumn, the leaves that fall become the nutrients in the end for new tree growth, for new plant growth. So certainly in an urbanizing world where the bulk of the world's resources are used by urban systems, we better end up learning from nature's circular systems as a key conceptual way in which to organize ourselves. And there's many people thinking about this kind of thing. Here's a diagram from Michael Braungardt's work on circular cradle-to-cradle production systems. And he differentiates very interestingly between the biological cycle and the technical cycle. So when it comes to, for instance, organic waste of our cities, it doesn't make sense to put any of that into landfills any longer, but really get serious about turning that into compost and using it on farmland, preferably on the edge of the city, but also within parks and gardens within cities themselves. But then to differentiate that from the technical cycle, because much of the recycling that we now do is actually downcycling. You take, a mixed plastic sort of, or a bunch of plastic that come from our supermarket trays and so on, and the bottles, plastic bottles and so on. They're very, very difficult to recycle into something that has higher value or the same value that it had as it was being used. And the same applies to most technical materials, that the technical materials that are being turned back into some useful other material really have a lower value at that point than they did have before. So it's a very important conceptual point that we are really talking more and more about downcycling rather than recycling per se. And here's just one picture of a town in Denmark called Kalundborg, where they have really taken the concept of recycling and reuse of materials from one production system, from one factory to another, to fine art, where they really make sure that they do their very best to reuse technical materials in connected production processes in such a way that at least the most efficient use of resources is made that way. And we can maybe talk about this in more detail later on. Now, talking about energy, so certainly we are seeing now really interesting developments about taking renewable energy options in combination with energy efficiency as a potential mainstay for supplying energy to our cities. And as a result of the great influence of the green politics in countries like Germany, the country is developing an energy system that will be really moving very, very rapidly towards making renewable energy, wind power, solar power, methane, and so on, as the mainstay for energy supply to cities. And one very interesting development that's taking place is that across Germany, many towns are taking back the energy companies that had been privatized and where new contracts have to be made, and taking them back under the control of the city government. So this is happening in dozens of different towns and cities in Germany, but also in Switzerland, also in Austria. And I think this is something of quite considerable relevance for the UK as well. How can we make sure that we are not relying any longer primarily on privatized energy companies that are primarily profit motivated instead of being community motivated and finding ways of getting control over energy systems in our cities back under the control of city governments. And so the technology options that are available now are really very considerable. In Britain, very impressively, we are seeing really significant developments in offshore wind power with the long coastlines in the UK, and that has options not only in terms of putting wind turbines into the seabed, but also to have floating turbines like on the right-hand side, or have underwater water turbines that are now being experimented with in places like Scotland, or on the right-hand side here, the possibility of producing hydrogen for hydrogen-powered freighters in the near future in ways that make the best possible use of wind turbine technology when electricity demand is lower, and to store that as hydrogen. In China, very major developments in that direction taking place. And then, of course, solar technology, having made enormous strides in recent years in very great variety of different technology and different applications. So this is certainly of very major significance for cities around the world. I mean, on the top left-hand side is Seville, now largely powered by solar electricity, solar thermal electricity. On the right-hand side at the top, a stadium in Taiwan powered entirely by solar and becoming a solar power station at the same time. Or on the left-hand side bottom, Freiburg in Germany, the new buildings that are fully powered, producing a surplus of electricity from their roofs. Or on the right-hand side, examples of solar buildings in China. We are seeing this kind of thing happening now in Devon and in Cornwall and so on, and certainly some people don't like ceiling landscapes with PV panels, but the animals the sheep can carry on grazing underneath, and it's certainly a very efficient way of using land surfaces. If you try to produce energy from growing maize or other feedstocks for methane production, you end up with far less production per acre than if you put PV panels on the same surface area. We are seeing new cars, electric cars now coming on the market, and the energy efficiency of cars running on electricity is far higher than that of internal combustion engines. Certainly, major producers like BMW are now getting into this, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the very near future. Electric bikes, of course. Or this maybe would be another alternative form of transport as well. There was earlier on quite a bit of discussion on urban agriculture. It's certainly a very strong trend all around the world now, how to reintegrate towns and cities into their own hinterland. This is a picture I took in Shanghai some years ago. Shanghai itself used to be permeated with urban farms in the past. That's no longer the case, but the authorities of Shanghai have set aside some 300,000 hectares of land around the periphery of the city in peri-urban landscapes for the purpose of producing vegetables, for stir-fry vegetables and so on, for use in the city. And that policy continues even though there's some encroachment in areas of land on the edge of these cities. This is a similar picture which I took outside Beijing. Greenhouses that are insulated with mats in the winter to carry on with vegetable production, even in the winter. And then, of course, the question of how this is a picture taken on the outskirts of Nairobi, but we are seeing similar pictures from many other countries now. Here, the example of Havana, Cuba, which has been transformed. I'm not sure whether that came up earlier on in the discussion today, by urban agriculture, food supplies from within the city itself. So the trend globally is to have peri-urban agriculture developing, but in some cities, like in Havana, it's within the city itself. This, of course, was driven by the collapse of the trading relationships with the Soviet Union in '89, so the need to create much greater food self-sufficiency within the cities of Cuba was very important at that time. One important point to make, however, is it would be an illusion to think that cities can be fully self-sufficient from within their own territory or even from their immediate hinterland when it comes to grain in particular and animal feeds. You're talking about pretty large areas where it's very hard to get all the food supplies from within, or certainly also from the peri-urban areas. Though, I mean, certainly there's now a very considerable interest in multi-story food cultivation using LED lights, preferably powered by renewable energy. And once you get into multi-story cultivation, then certainly vegetable supplies from within urban areas have great potential, and that is certainly being pursued now in quite a number of different locations around the world. Architecture integrating green spaces in order to increase the area covered by vegetation within cities, another important part of the future city. Now, to end my talk, I just want to talk briefly about work I was involved in Adelaide 10 years ago when I was asked by the government of South Australia to be a thinker in residence, to rethink a city region from not just sustainability perspectives, but from regenerative urban development perspectives, by which I mean cities really reconnecting to the hinterland and to kind of have a bit of a, much better give and take between urban consumption and the surrounding countryside. So I was able to work with all the community groups and companies and commercial enterprises and over a 10-week period to develop a plan for Adelaide in terms of renewable energy, in terms of recycling and these kind of initiatives. So here, for instance, taking plastics and turning it back into useful some materials or fence posts, benches and so on, where you can make use of different types of plastic in a sort of sandwich of different materials that can then end up as long-lasting fence posts and benches and and so on, that where plastics are used in ways that they should be used, which is long-lived materials. But very importantly, organic waste. Adelaide, from practically nothing 10 years ago, is now recycling 180,000 tons of organic waste coming from the city and utilized on the edge of the city in an area of farmland called Virginia, where food is grown vegetables are grown, also utilizing wastewater from the city as irrigation water in a water-stressed region of the world. And so it's really impressive how the policies were developed by the city government to really get serious about assuring water-efficient agriculture, vegetable growing for use in the city, much of the produce being sold in the central market in the city. So to kind of summarize the kind of transformations that are really needed in an urbanizing world, which we tried to implement and some succeeded to some extent in implementing in Adelaide, it really active moves towards energy efficiency, moving very rapidly towards solar, electricity, wind power, PV roofs on public buildings, solar hot water systems, very large-scale tree planting on the edge of the city, reduction in CO2 emissions, water-sensitive urban development, and then really significant recycling of both technical as well as organic materials. And I'm pleased to say that Bristol has been declared as European Green Capital for 2015, and the Mayor of Bristol, George Ferguson, who was recently elected, wants to have an Adelaide type of transformation process taking place there, and so we're going to I've started work on this now. But just to finish on one example from China, which I think is quite striking, which is really looking beyond the city region itself to try and see how actions at the government level within cities, but also national government level, can help to change landscapes on whose health cities ultimately depend. This is the Yellow River, major dams having been constructed there, carrying heavy loads of silt. And you can see once a year they're trying to flush the reservoir of this particular dam near Lanzhou out and try and get rid of as much of the silt within the reservoir as possible. But very importantly, really restoring land in the catchment areas, in the uplands above, in the water catchment areas of the Yellow River, from this kind of landscape to this kind of landscape. This is the same picture 10 years after a very major reforestation and terracing project was undertaken. And so you end up with far less silt load in the river. And that certainly is part of the idea of regenerative cities, that cities have to take care of the areas ultimately where the water supply comes from, where erosion takes place, and where food supplies come. So these are deliberate policy initiatives that we need to initiate, I think. And here's just one final example from London that might interest you. The Crossrail, well, there's significant wind power development now taking place in the Thames Estuary, with the world's largest wind farm now in the Thames Estuary called the London Array, 170 of these turbines having recently been completed. And when the whole project is completed, this will be about 30% of London's domestic electricity supply. So this is really quite impressive stuff that is now happening in the UK. And here's another example of regenerative urban development, which is Crossrail here, digging out some 5 million tons of soil from underneath the city. And all of this is going to be reused, already being reused, to build a nature reserve in Wallasey Island on the Essex coast in order to revive an area where for bird migration, in a wetland area not far from London, but utilizing soil from underneath London as a way of resuscitating and creating a wetland reserve on the Essex coast. Just one final point here from Curitiba in Brazil, the importance of public information about how changes in people's behavior patterns influence the use of resources within cities. Here, this is a display on paper recycling and cardboard recycling, and how many trees have been saved as a result of recycling activities. And so I think it would be great if we could persuade Boris Johnson to begin to put public displays in the city here in London to show how changes in behavior in recycling, energy efficiency, and improvements in air quality and so on are directly linked to people's personal behavior patterns. So I think these are really important things for the future of our cities, to really have adequate information on which we can act. And just to finish that here, the kind of summary of the concept of ecopolis, the regenerative cities. Obviously, energy efficient use of energy resources, reconnecting cities to the hinterland, regenerative waste management, regional food supplies as much as possible, watershed restoration, but very importantly also finding ways of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and countering soil erosion in the process. And do you know what this is? Anybody? Any offers? Yeah, it's a portrait of the internet. The way we are globally connected, of course, the internet is not all used for beneficial purposes, as we've heard about a lot from Snowden's work recently, but certainly the global connectedness that we have available to us now through new technologies enables us to learn very quickly across the planet from each other about best practice and best policy initiatives by cities around the world. And so this learning process, I think, is absolutely crucial for an urban future. And here's some publications that might interest you that I've been involved with. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Herbert. That's fantastic. There's some really great stuff there. We've caught up the time we were late by, so we do have a few minutes for some questions. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. You said that it was unreasonable for us to consider or imagine of a city that could exist entirely within its own boundaries or within its near hinterland. But I was wondering if, as a conceptual exercise, you've looked into that, of what kinds of changes that would mean, what kinds of things would have to be incorporated into the city. Just conceptually, what we would need to do to try and exist in a local environment, and what kinds of things would have to be eliminated to make that even remotely possible.
Well, I think I've tried to summarize this, but I mean, I can cover some of the points again. I mean, certainly, first of all, I mean, the energy dependence of our cities, particularly with massive fossil fuel inputs, the more that can be reduced, and the more the energy that we actually continue using can be produced from renewable energy, first of all within cities themselves, but then obviously from the urban hinterland. So I mean, certainly with the example of Adelaide, wind power and solar electricity between them are now supplying 30% of the electricity used within that city, with the figure going up all the time, using policies like feed-in tariffs to facilitate that process. So that's number one. Number two is obviously the question of food supplies. And as I did emphasize, when it comes to vegetables and fruit and so on, we can do an awful lot within urban areas if we had chose to do so. I mean, in the Second World War, when Hyde Park was a vegetable garden, that obviously is not likely to happen in peacetime, but certainly there are urban farms developing in towns and cities all over Europe, particularly in the peri-urban areas. So reconnecting towns and cities back to their immediate hinterland to find ways of competing with the global food suppliers that come through supermarkets as they currently do. It's certainly a very desirable process, I would say, to initiate. When it comes to transportation, I mean, when you look, for instance, at Copenhagen as a city, they've really redesigned the city from the inside out, with pedestrian areas taking over from car populated streets, assuring that you end up with a livable urban center that really allows people to interact with each other in really exciting sort of ways. But then, moving seriously towards, renewable energy. I mean, Copenhagen as a city, for instance, has really moving very fast towards 100% renewable energy electricity supply in the coming years. They have a plan to do that by, I think, 2030. And quite a few German towns and cities are now on the same trajectory of getting, for instance, energy from nearby farms and villages to supply larger towns and cities nearby with renewable electricity. So this is beginning to happen in the UK in various places as well, and in America too. I mean, it's certainly quite exciting. For instance, in California, you have companies like Solar City in California that are supplying a very substantial increase in renewable electricity from rooftops within the city region itself. And so certainly all these steps, combined will transform urban systems from utter reliance on fossil fuels towards really making serious moves towards regenerative energy systems and also regenerating, ecosystems ultimately around the city region itself by a give and take. At the moment, we are very good at taking from nature, but giving nothing back. And that's no longer adequate as a concept for the future of our cities. And that can certainly be built into the way we operate resource use systems within our cities.
There will be some external dependence for food, but the city has got to find a way to interact with the rural food economy, which is sustainable.
Yeah, so certainly the example from Adelaide that, of course, I talk quite very quickly because of limited time, but certainly the example of Adelaide shows how you can take the organic waste from the city, use it to enrich farmland on the edge of the city, and at the same time get back a very nice supply of vegetables and fruit from the urban hinterland again. In Adelaide, it's interesting because it's a relatively isolated area, isolated from the rest of Australia. So it's different from having, urban areas that are closely linked with each other across, geographies in Europe. But nevertheless, certainly you are seeing in France and Italy and so on still a very considerable reliance of food supplies from nearby. And I think we need to build on those existing examples and improve upon them.
Yeah.
Maybe a silly question, but I was thinking all these adapting technologies and everything that we want to, or we are talking about to make cities more sustainable. Is there a limit as to the size of the city at which we cannot make these things happen anymore? Is it not effective, or is human ingenuity be able to go to new lands and always, because if cities will keep growing, I suppose. I don't know whether there's a limit of growth for cities as well.
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. I think it's a very, very important question. I mean, one point I didn't make is that the majority of people in the world today, in an urbanizing world, still live in smaller cities. I mean, typically up to 1 million people. It doesn't sound like a small city historically, but in current terms, it is a relatively small city. So certainly, the large cities on the planet are about 23 cities of over 10 million, mega cities. It will certainly be much harder for them to kind of go on this kind of trajectory of getting serious about not just sustainable but regenerative development. But I mean, London, will be a test case in terms of how much, a city of 7.5 million people like London can really begin to make inroads on renewable energy supplies. As I showed the example from the Thames estuary, the Thames Array, certainly, the actual roof areas in a city like London would certainly have the potential to be very significant in terms of electricity supply. Obviously, they're intermittent supplies, so we have to take that into account. We need energy storage systems and so on and so forth. But when it comes to really huge cities of 20 or 30 million, it is, I think, becomes increasingly difficult for those cities to get serious about the kind of ideas that I was talking about. Ironically, those are the very cities ultimately threatened most by climate change and sea level rises. So I think, I'm not aware of adequate studies that yet give a full answer to the question that you raised. There's a very interesting grouping of cities called the C40, which was actually initiated from London under Ken Livingstone and Nicky Gavron when they were mayor and deputy mayor here, to link the world's largest cities together as a mutual learning process on best practice and best policies. And so certainly there's a lot of thinking underway about how to deal with these very large cities in terms of their long-term viability. But certainly I think a short answer to your question is it helps to not be a mega city, but it would be, certainly from a point of view of the kind of scenario that I presented here, it helps to be a city of a few 100,000 rather than a few tens of million people.
Thanks. Yeah.
Hi there. I just wondered to what extent we need to completely go in the other direction. I mean, you've talked about almost as if it's a done deal that future people are going to live more and more in cities and the cities are going to get bigger. Yeah. And yet you've also talked about how London, with 12% of the UK population, needs twice the UK's land area. Now, if that's the case, I mean, should we not be looking more at things like Zero Carbon Britain and their notion that for as much as focus on technology as you've talked about, we have an equal, if not greater, focus on culture change and sharing, if you like.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, is the future for your ecopolis not so much a city, but maybe something that doesn't have any more than 50 or 100,000 inhabitants in each?
Yeah, or less. I mean,
which could imply a certain deurbanization and creation of smaller farms and that kind of thing.
I mean, Robert referred to a book that I edited in '76 called Land for the People, which was about rebalancing town and country and rural and urban populations. At Britain at the present time, only about 1.5% of people actually work the land any longer, I mean, in farms. Obviously, there are a lot more gardeners than that. But I mean, the question does have to be raised ultimately also in a deindustrializing country. I mean, where's the economic base for a country like the UK, which has decaying cities in quite a few places now? Let's be clear about that. And what could be the future economic base for cities that have really lost a lot of their economic livelihoods? So certainly, I think there needs to be, in what you might call overdeveloped countries, there need to be new thought process about how to balance rural and urban living. Of course, at the moment, villages tend to be, and I live in a village myself near Bristol. Villages tend to be commuter villages at the present time, rather than being still connected, for instance, to rural areas. I mean, typically you have villages that have large farms nearby, and the local people don't get a look in. So the question of how ultimately there can be a reconnection between our settlements and on an island like Britain and the local countryside, partly also from the point of view of livelihoods, is an important issue. I think certainly, I emphasize technology because the technology certainly must be one of the drivers for change, but absolutely right to emphasize culture change and also the question of livelihoods and, not quality of life rather than simply ever more economic growth. I mean, all of these things need to be taken into account in a scenario like this.
Graham Stevens, bluegreenuk.com. As we speak, the planning inspectorate in London is 1 month into a 6-month program of making possibly the most catastrophic policy decision in planning consent. I was wondering, they seem to be going roughshod over the European law. Would you say that the political pressure from other cities is a far greater influence on governments than their own planning laws, for example? I mean, when you get this, the scale of the disaster impending, how do you bring to bear influence for common sense?
Well, it's a very difficult point to get into. I mean, the reality is that the current political system, or the spectrum of political opinion, as represented by the two parties that have major relevance, in politics in the UK, we are not seeing the sort of thinking that I try to represent here in my talk very much. I mean, historically speaking, I mean, London, I mean, after the Second World War, Abercrombie and the Greenbelt around London, I mean, that was a fairly sound decision to make. And now we are seeing, you know, that endangered because London being the UK's boom town, you know, in terms of its economy and the fact that people want to live here, not just British people, but from all over the world, and particularly rich people from India or from China or from Russia or whatever, all buying up properties in London. So there is a pressure for London to you know, get even bigger than it currently is. London, as I said at the beginning, is one of 2 global cities. So the power of London's financial sector, even though it sort of has come unstuck in a major way recently, is still regarded as the place where where the UK's economy, you know, which dominates the UK's economy. I think ultimately that is a dangerous fallacy. I think we need to get real about how much longer London can be primarily a city with a financial economy as the main part of its economy, and whether or not ultimately we need to think longer term about how to rebalance the UK's economy as a whole, and then make decisions accordingly to try and, you know, get in Britain, you know, other towns and cities to get a look in terms of, you know, the way Britain operates. I mean, Bristol, I brought up the example of Bristol, and Bristol is a very interesting case at the moment because, ironic, or, you know, intriguingly, an independent candidate was elected as mayor, George Ferguson. And basically, you know, if he had represented a party, he would certainly be the Green Party, even though he's not strictly a member of that. So, you know, there's certainly now major initiatives underway to try and show how a city like Bristol, which is, you know, still quite a wealthy city, could actually become a sustainable or indeed a regenerative city. So there's a lot of thinking going on right now with an eye on 2015 when Bristol will be European Green Capital, to try and show whether new perspectives that can be developed there can have relevance for urban planning and for the rest of the UK as well. But I'm not sure whether I fully answered your question. We are certainly, the pressure is still for us to go very much in the wrong direction, I would say. Yes, absolutely.
I think it's a question of global governance, isn't it? I mean, you know, what say do you have in preventing a Fukushima, for example?
Well, as you know, I mean, there's a nuclear power station about to start construction in Hinkley Point, not that far from Bristol as well. And when there are some countries, as you know, like Germany, that because of the pressure of green politics, has gone for basically trying to build a renewable energy system, and they're, you know, it's well underway with feed-in tariffs as the main policy driver for that to happen. And the phasing out of nuclear power is a major part of that story. Though, I mean, there's certainly still a significant amount of fossil fuel energy involved even in that energy system. But certainly there are 1 or 2 countries in Europe, Denmark being another one, that are trying to not only go down a renewable energy path, energy-efficient renewable energy path, but also to try and come up with urban systems that are future-proof in ways that I was trying to sort of suggest in my talk. So there are, on the one hand, the forces of economic globalization and financial pressure from cities like London to change the way other countries urbanize, like China and India, in terms of new, you know, investment in new industries there and so on. On the other hand, there are countries that are trying to see whether or not, you know, renewable energy efficiency, circular economies and so on could be taken seriously and could be a solid base for a future economy.
I'll take one final question.
I was just wondering what you thought would be the biggest... Thank you. I was wondering what you thought would be the biggest single obstacle to allowing us to transform to a more sustainable, circular, regenerative city model. Would it be, sort of, for example, finance? Is it policy? Is it people, behavioral change? I'm trying to really understand what is the main obstacle to getting this transformation.
Well, I think you listed the important ones, didn't you? I think, I mean, basically the financial system still drives us towards trying to forever get maximum return on investment whilst ignoring externalities. So I mean, that is still, you know, and it's certainly still the City of London is driving that process as much as Wall Street, I'd say, absolutely, at this moment in time. Behavior change, obviously we are driven forever to be, to consider ourselves as consumers rather than as people with children whose future we are concerned about. So we are not, you know, regarded as fully human beings, really, by decision makers and by the commercial sector. We are regarded as people who are going to vote for that party with a short-sighted perspective on the future of the planet on the one hand, and by the commercial sector, you know, is driving us to forever react to the advertisements, to buy more and to not consider, you know, what the implications of our consumerism on the planet are. So I think, you know, you listed the three obstacles. I mean, policy, of course, you know, I mean, Gordon Brown and Ed Miliband introduced feed-in tariffs about 5 or 6 years ago for renewable energy. And that would have helped Britain to, you know, really accelerate even more than it now happening, you know, moves towards renewable energy implementation. And then Cameron comes along and they say, okay, we're the greenest government ever. But you know, reducing feed-in tariffs to an extent that has massively slowed down the process of implementing renewable energy. I mean, there are some positive things that are happening. For instance, the landfill tax, which, you know, goes up every year, which really has driven recycling up significantly in the UK, even though, as I said, there's a bit of incineration happening, but not you know, I mean, there's a lot more recycling of household waste now than before. But yes, I mean, in some instances, you know, there's some incineration. I think there's one, the new one was built in near Heathrow, wasn't there? I think there's another plan for South Wales. But I don't know about other, do you know about other plans for incinerators?
There's about 50 or 100 planned across the UK. What seems to happen is every year when the landfill tax goes up, the incinerators charge that amount of money increase on their gate fees. They make loads of money, and loads of people are building incinerators. And I think it's linked to the thing about downcycling, that the technological things which are getting credence are those which are downcycling and are maximising investment for profit for developers, not necessarily increasing reuse and recycling and remaking. I mean, you know, we've a high street which is controlled by retailers, but that comes from retailoring, the idea that we remake things locally. The waste hierarchy seems to be focused on downcycling and incineration, crushing glass to use on construction sites rather than remaking it back in bottles again. I mean, that seems to be where it's going at the moment.
Well, thank you for that contribution. I wasn't aware about. Is that so, that there's so many incinerators now on the drawing board?
Yeah, and 40% of household glass is being used by the construction industry as an alternative to sand in the UK, rather than actually being made back into bottles.
Well, thank you for that bit of information. I wasn't fully aware of that. Thank you.
Well, we have got refreshments outside, I think, and the networking part of the conference is an important aspect. So I'll draw this session to a close. Thanks again, Herbert. That was a really great contribution, giving the big picture and drawing together all the different strands of the discussion today. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Robert.